Well, today's reading, which you just heard, got me thinking about prominent women in the Old Testament, and I wondered how many people have even heard the story of Deborah, or many of the stories in the Old Testament about women. And so I did what any good, theological researcher would do. I went to Facebook. So I asked people on Facebook to name one woman from the Old Testament. Just one. I didn't want stories or explanations. I just wanted them to name one woman from the Old Testament. And I had over 100 responses. I was pretty pleased with my research. They named 22 people, 22 women, which means that several people, of course, named the same woman twice. And a couple people went rogue and named some women from the New Testament, which were more familiar to them. And some people even named a woman that they just knew the name but knew nothing about her. It was a name that they thought they maybe had heard. But overall, I thought my research was pretty good. It proved the point that I was considering, which is that we don't know much about women in the Old Testament because there aren't very many women in the Old Testament. And so this is a reading from our lectionary. And as many of you know, the lectionary is a cyclical group of readings that churches all around the world use. And so on any given Sunday, churches all over the world are reading the same scriptures. 3 to 4 scriptures are in the lectionary. And so the lectionary operates on this 3-year cycle. So in theory, you would hear, a particular passage once every 3 years. So it occurred to me that the story of Deborah then only happens once every 3 years. If you happen to be sick on this particular Sunday, you got to wait another 3 years to hear about her. So no wonder so few of my Facebook friends had ever heard of Deborah. And as if women's voices were not scarce enough in the history of the world, the women who do make it into Scripture only get talked about once every 3 years. So let me ask you this. How are our little girls and our women supposed to see themselves in the history of the world if we only talk about them every 3 years? The answer is they won't. Maya Angelou, the great poet and author, said, "There is no agony like bearing an unnamed story inside of you." For thousands of years, women have been subtly and not so subtly excluded from the stories of our faith. And that is an agony that I don't want to pass on to the next generation of our sons and daughters. So at least this week and next, we are going to be talking about women and looking at our scriptures through the lens of women. Interestingly, but probably not surprisingly to you, the story of Deborah is actually 2 full chapters in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and chapter 5. But in the lectionary reading, it's given a scant 7 verses, which you just heard Andrew so brilliantly read. But I think Deborah's story deserves a little bit more attention than those 7 verses. So this is Deborah's story, and it's a doozy. Deborah was a prophet, the wife of Lapidote, and she was leading Israel at that time. Okay, so we're just going to stop right there, because just in that little bit, there is so much to unpack. In the Old Testament, the most powerful leaders in the communities were kings, prophets, and priests. And a prophet was not a fortune teller. A prophet was one who called people back into right relationship with God. Prophets knew that God was an active agent in the world, actively working in relationship with people. And so it was their call, their duty, to be God's voice to the people. Prophets saw what was wrong with the world in a way that other people often missed. Deborah was also a judge, appointed by her community as a woman of wisdom. And since this was a time when Israel didn't yet have a king or a centralized government, the judges were called on in times of crisis to lead, even on the front lines of the military action. So in short, Deborah was the leader of Israel at that time. She was commander-in-chief, which is why it strikes me that the author had to describe her as somebody's wife. Now, I know that it was customary, it was the cultural norm at the time to label women in this way, just like it was culturally normal to name men as the son of someone. I understand that, but I think you will also want to know that wife of Lapidoth actually translates to woman of fire, or woman of torches, or lightning flashes. So, girls, if you're looking for a role model, a superhero, how about woman of fire? I mean, that's pretty good. So we have a prophet of God, we have a judge, and we have people crying out to God in this story. And then God hears the people, and he sends Deborah, woman of fire, instructing her to send Barak into battle on their behalf, on the people's behalf. See, the Israelites have been living in Canaan for the past 20 years at this time, and they have been harshly treated and oppressed by the king, which you just heard about, King Jabin. So Deborah, woman of fire, orders Barak to lead the troops into battle against the king and his general, a man named Sisera. And that's the end of the reading as you heard it today. But it picks up with this in verse 8. Barak says, okay, I'll go into battle, but only if you come with me. Now, Deborah, woman of fire, was attuned to God's will as a prophet. Because of her relationship with God, she was able to be the voice for God in the world and to lead and make wise decisions. And so because of this, she was a force to be reckoned with, and Barak wanted her near him when he marched into battle with the troops. So they go into battle, and they wind up defeating all of the men in Canaan's army, all but one, the general Sisera. Sisera escaped the battle and fled on foot into a nearby community, and he spotted a tent, and he lets himself in. Now, the tent was occupied by a woman named Jael, and you're going to want to remember that name, because Jael invites Sisera into the tent. She says, please lie down and rest. You must be so tired. She covers him with a blanket. He asks for a glass of water, and she says, oh, let me give you some of my goat milk. And she offers him her own milk. She is the proper hostess par excellence. And then Sisera begins to let down his guard a little bit because he feels so comforted and so taken care of. And so he lies down and he says he's going to take a little nap. He's going to sleep. But he says to her first, I want you to keep watch at the door. And if anybody comes looking for me, you tell them I'm not here. But for some reason still unknown to us today, Jael does not do that. Not at all. Jael waits for him to fall asleep, and then she goes and retrieves a tent peg and a hammer. And our Holy Scriptures say, she went quietly to him and drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. You cannot make this up. From then on, the Scriptures say, the Israelites were freed from oppression in Canaan. Now, if that all seems like something a little more akin to an episode of the Game of Thrones, I think you're right. And that might also be the reason that we only usually get to hear the first 7 verses in the lectionary, because the rest of it is just super exciting and made for TV. But this is a story This is a story, and I encourage you to go look it up. Judges chapter 4 and chapter 5 tell this amazing story of courage and wisdom and power and strength. It's a story about a woman, but it's not only a story for women any more than the stories of men are only meant for the men. Because ultimately, the message of Deborah, and to a large extent Jael, isn't look what women can do. It's look what God can do. You see, the people had stopped following God. They had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord, which is a common theme we hear in the Old Testament, certainly common still today. And they had fallen away from God. And so they had found themselves smack in the middle of this heartless, oppressive regime. And finally, after 20 years of harsh treatment and harsh living, they turn back to God and cry out for help. And God hears them, and God shows up. Friends, we sometimes lose our way. We follow where we should not follow, and we go in directions that we were never called. We place our energy on things that disconnect us from spirit, things that disconnect us from our true wisdom, things that disconnect us from love. And the consequences of that way of living can lead us into places that we don't quite know how to get ourselves out of. When we do that, God can feel very, very far away. God can feel as though God doesn't even exist to us. Or worse, that God exists but doesn't care. Yet the moment that we acknowledge that we've made a wrong turn, God is there. Like a parent who leaps out of bed in the middle of the night at just the smallest little whimper, God is with us, leading us out of fear, leading us out of oppression, freeing us from whatever it is that we may have gotten ourselves bound up in. And how do we come to know this with any kind of certainty? Through stories, through the arc of humankind, through the resilience we see in our own family histories. It's in stories that we see God's faithfulness and guidance and love. We see ourselves in someone else's story. Stories connect us to thoughts and ideas and emotions. Stories help us come to know ourselves and help us come to know others better. Stories make us feel less alone because we can see ourselves in them. We hear the lyrics to a song, for example, and we say, yes, that's it. That's how I feel. Or we read a novel and it touches us so deeply that we wonder, how could someone write the words to our experience? We hear someone share their story about depression or suicide or illness, and it brings us to tears because in their story, we see ours and we feel validated. Our Christian communion itself, which we will celebrate soon, the body and the blood of Christ, is a reenactment of a biblical story, the Last Supper. Stories are powerful ways to remember ourselves to the past. So a few years ago, a group of women theologians got together and they meticulously counted every single woman mentioned in the Bible, and they counted 93. So roughly 5% of all people in the Bible. Only 49 of those, however, are named, but that's okay. That's okay, right? Women, we know we were there. We know that the women are there. We can read between the lines. And in fact, I actually want you women to know right now, take heart, because you may not be talked about a lot in our scriptures, but know this, every single important event every important biblical theme had at its heart a woman. Abraham had Sarah. Sarah is the one who gave birth, literally, to the nation. Moses was saved by 4 courageous and strong women, 2 of whom, by the way, we're going to talk about next week. The great prophet Samuel, his amazing mother Hannah, poured out her prayers and promised her son to God's care and safekeeping. Jesus, of course, had Mary. Jesus' first miracle, which set the events of his ministry life into motion, wouldn't have happened without his mother's nudging. The woman at the well has the longest recorded conversation with Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, but only because his sister went and got him. Lazarus' sister made Jesus come. So make no mistake, women and girls, we see you all over the biblical story. In the mundane and the shadows, yes, but also in the most important events in our shared religious history. Listening to each other's stories is what brings solidarity and common ground. And as much as stories help us understand ourselves better, they also connect us to others. So we need all voices. We need minority voices, Black, Latino, Asian, gay and lesbian voices, transgender voices, Republican and Democrat voices. We need big city voices and rural voices. Why? Because listening to someone's story is the first step to healing and reconciliation. Deep transformational change is about relationships. Transformational change recognizes that my humanity is bound up with yours. Robert talked about this idea last week with Ubuntu, the African ideal that I am because we are. We need to hear people's stories. We've heard a lot of talk lately about unity and healing the divides in our country. A lot of people feel fractured, and we want more harmony. Well, any good musician will tell you that harmony happens when people sing different parts. When I listen to the story of Deborah, woman of fire, I am reminded that God needs us all singing our parts. And we need to lift up the ones who aren't singing and find out why. In the story of Deborah, I'm reminded that God hears the cries of all people, and he asks us to do the same. To love God's people by listening, to love God's people by making them feel seen and heard. I've heard it said that listening and being listened to is so close to being loved that the average person can't tell the difference. Today, you might be calling out for help, ready to unburden yourself of an untold story. Or you might be like Deborah, called by God to answer the cries of others and leading the charge for change in the world. And in all things, in every circumstance, we are assured of this: God sees us, God hears us, and God is with us. In this moment, every single one of us, you are seen and you are loved. Amen. Gracious God, we ask you to come into those quiet places of our heart right now. Help us identify those places where we need to tell our story, those places where we need to be seen for who we are. And God, I ask that you give each of us listening ears so that we might express your love through the simple act of listening.